Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Someday good news, but not good. Deadline, same as been all along. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline defied end of day, 11:59 p.m. on June 9th. Exam 3, deadline defied on end of day, June 17th. And then exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, deadline defied on June 18th.
You said something about today?
Nope, nothing. First,
I thought I heard something today. I was like, what?
Nope. I don't think so. Unless I'm hallucinating or something. Which could be the case. For the paper, the draft deadline, if you want to do one, is June 10th. And again, you can do as many drafts as you want until either you get the grades you want on it, or you get sick of the process, or time ends. Then the deadline for the +5 bonus is June 11th. Deadline for full credit is June 15th. Deadline for half credit is June 18th. Then the final grades go on June 19th. So be sure to check your grades like on the 18th to make sure everything is as you think it should be, and contact me before the final grades go in, because before the final grades go in, I can easily just go on iRattler and change a grade. But if something goes, if I'm not aware of something that's gone wrong until after that, it's considerably more difficult. Okay, before going on to the new stuff, any stuff about the stuff to be, or the stuff that has been, going to the new stuff. Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend John Locke, talking about that personal identity thing. And we saw Locke ends up with a fairly complicated view in that a person, well, you end up with like this kind of thing. You've got the body, which is a material substance, and being the same man or woman, not to be sexist, is one continued life with material substance kind of flowing through that. Then you get the immaterial substance, or the soul, and then again for Locke, that's not the person, and then there's the consciousness, kind of like your awareness and memory that makes each of us who we are. And then he considers, kind of the first important question: could consciousness be transferred? And his answer is, well, no, because that would create all kinds of problems, so God doesn't allow that to happen, or so he claims. The second problem was, could you have the same, soul, but different consciousness? He gives the example of Nestor, the hero, one of the heroes in the Battle of Troy, and maybe you have the same soul as Nestor. But his claim is that having the same soul, but not the same consciousness, doesn't make you that person any more than you just happened through some bizarre coincidence to have all the molecules that made up Nestor's body. It wouldn't make you Nestor. Just be kind of a weird coincidence. Then we looked at his consideration of the problem of resurrection, and now we pick up with the new stuff. Now to illustrate his view, he gives this scenario of the prince and the cobbler, as opposed to the classic story of the prince and the pauper. And what we're supposed to imagine is this. You've got some poor cobbler who's got a soulless body, probably some sort of horrible cobbling accident that destroyed his or her soul. Not sure how that works, but you just imagine that. So, soulless body, then you get the prince. And somehow, the soul of the prince leaves the original body and zoop, ends up in the body of the cobbler. Now, given Locke's view, he doesn't actually argue that this is how it would work, but given his view to illustrate it, here's how it would work. To everyone else, from the outside, the cobbler would seem to be the same man. So if the cobbler was like, Cody the cobbler, everyone would see seeing the body walking around and say, hey Cody, how you doing? How's the cobbling business? But to the prince, he would of course still be the prince, because he still has all his memories, etc. So the point of this weird example is not that souls go hopping around in different bodies, although we call that possession. It's that wherever the consciousness goes, there goes the person. And so the body goes into making up the same man, so it would be the same man as the cobbler, because as far as everyone could tell, that would be the cobbler. But from the standpoint of the prince, who has some princely memories, he would still be himself, the prince, or so he claims. Now Locke does note that this whole thing about talking about person, man, soul, body, etc. can be a bit confusing, which is because it is, knowing how to like label stuff. And he notes that in our ordinary way of speaking, we often use, person, man, woman, what, etc. interchangeably, being kind of informal and perhaps a little sloppy. But he claims that as long as we determine what our terms mean, then we can kind of sort things out. His view is kind of, well, we can apply sounds as we will, but it's kind of important that we're clear about what we mean by our own terms. And this becomes pretty much a standard part of philosophy, sorting out what terms mean. And so, for Locke, to recap there, you got same man, woman, that's the life, continuing life with the flow of matter through it. You got the soul, you got the same soul, which are all the same thing as the same person, and the person is his or her consciousness. So where that goes, the person goes. Or so it claims. Now, just to make sure that people get his point, he just keeps kind of repeating it. And so consciousness makes the self. Now you may wonder, so why is that, why think that? Well, one reason we saw before is kind of the empiricism thing. If you're an empiricist, you believe that whatever you know about the stuff comes to the senses. And the inner sense is like memory. So before we had digital cameras and so forth, how would you know that it was you? Well, you'd rely on your memory. If I remember doing it, it was me. I don't remember, I wouldn't think it was me. Also, Locke brings up the fact that what matters to us is happiness, misery, pleasure, and pain, that we're concerned about ourselves. And what he sees this as amounting to is, I'm not really concerned about the substance. I mean, to use kind of a crappy illustration, once I'm dead, I'm not super worried about what's going to happen to the matter that made me up. I'm not going to be super worried about that, because I'll be super dead. What I'm concerned about is, myself, my future happiness, past happiness, future misery or past misery. And his view is basically, we don't really care about the substance, we care about ourself, and he regards that as the consciousness. Now, to illustrate this even more, he brings up the little finger thing. And again, he doesn't think that this is the kind of thing that can really happen, but he asks us to imagine, sort of a bizarre scenario to make his point kind of dramatically. Imagine that you're in shop class, or you're doing a little do-it-yourself project involving a table saw. And you're cutting the wood and shoop, there goes the little finger. I've seen that happen, it's pretty horrifying. Not to myself, still got all my fingers. And so the finger flies off. And normally, of course, what we think is, you'd be standing there, blood spraying out of your hand, looking down your finger, horrified. He's saying, quick, put that on ice and get me to the hospital. But Locke asked us to imagine a bizarre and probably impossible scenario where instead of you being in the body looking at the little finger, your conscious is somehow on the little finger looking up at the body. Now again, he doesn't claim this is something that happens or even can happen, but it's to illustrate his point. Wherever you go, wherever your consciousness goes, you go. So if bizarrely you were conscious of being the finger laying there on the floor looking up at your body, just kind of, leaning not lifelessly, but purposely against the wall, you think, oh quick, get me reattached to my body. And that's what he claims. So wherever you go, wherever your consciousness goes, you go.
Does that apply to afterlife as well?
Yeah, so if you were to die, wherever your consciousness happens to go, that's where you are. So I guess when the body goes away, wherever that happens to die, be it a good place or a bad place. And then for Locke, for Judgment Day and resurrection, the consciousness is restored, given a new body, and then it's still the person because they still have all those memories. To use kind of a crap analogy, it'd be if think of a file on your laptop. Imagine there's a file that's you. And of course you can move the file from computer to computer to computer, and Judgment Day for the computer would kind of be maybe 100 years or 1,000 years from now, that file is put into a new computer, and there it is, and that's, it's back, type of thing. Or that's what he thinks. As to what really happens, I don't know. So for him, consciousness makes the person he or she is. And as far back as a consciousness reach, that's how far back the person goes. And as far forward as a consciousness extends, that's as far as a person goes as well. Now, one of the reasons why personal identity is, kind of important, one thing, of course, is, as you mentioned, the afterlife thing. Because what it is that makes the person decides whether we get an afterlife or we don't. So if whatever it is that we are could survive bodily death, then an afterlife is possible. If not, this is it. Once it's over, game over. Now he notes that another important aspect of personal identity is this. The justice, the rightness, the wrongness of all reward and punishment depends on personal identity. As I mentioned yesterday, it's only just to reward the person who earned the reward. So, if the Olympics and, the person who deserves the gold medal in the marathon is the person who wins it, not someone who just happens to look like them. Similarly for, things, misdeeds, the person who deserves to be punished for like a terrible crime is the person that did it, not someone who just happens to look like her. Which seems, true. That it's only just if the person who committed the misdeed is punished, and only just if the person who did the good deed is rewarded. Then he brings up the little finger again. I don't know, he's got some kind of obsession with that. The example doesn't change, so I won't repeat it. And he then goes into more about his view of personal identity. Again, as he said many, many, many times, what makes the person is not the same substance, but the identity of consciousness. And he gives the example of Socrates. Suppose Socrates had actually it'd be, in a way, two people. So you've got Socrates awake, and you get Soc asleep. And he asks us to imagine that you've got Socrates awake and Socrates sleeping. And if they're different consciousnesses, Locke says that they be different people, and if Socrates awake does something bad, Socrates asleep would not be justly punished for it. And so, again, his deal is that you are your consciousness, whatever you're conscious of doing, you're responsible for, whatever you're not conscious of, wouldn't be you. It'd be somebody else. Perhaps sharing the same body as you, but not you. And he thinks that's the foundation for just punishment and reward. Now he brings up a kind of interesting or perhaps boring problem, namely this. He notes that, he considers the following case, and it's one that comes up in law courts occasionally, and it can be called kind of the classic version is the drunk defense, which many first-time lawyers usually try for some reason. But kind of the defense is basically the person was too drunk to know what they're doing, which is generally never successful. Now, Locke does claim that we do distinguish between cases where a person is the same person or not the same person. And here's how he reasons. He claims that in cases, take a case of like drunkenness. Now, given Locke's theory, if someone truly does not remember, they would not be the same person. So they would be, on Locke's theory, innocent. But of course, in our legal system, does that defense work? Can someone say, wasn't me because I was too drunk to remember what I was doing? Typically, no. Why not? Well, the reason is that in such cases, we don't know. Suppose, let me take an example. Suppose someone's on spring break and there's like a video of them, standing atop a burning police car, throwing, Molotov cocktails into a crowd. And they're like arrested the next day. And they wake up and they say, hey, I don't remember any of that. I've read Locke, I'm totally innocent. Now, of course, obviously that Locke defense is not going to work, because the way the system would work is that the person can't prove it wasn't them. But, I mean, it's not up in the way Locke's putting the burden of proof such, it's not up to the court to prove that it was the person. It'd be up to the person to prove that somehow they were not the person. And if they get, the videotapes and all kinds of evidence, the fact is proved against the person that it was the same, man, and there's no way to tell, in terms of forensic science, whether it was the same person. So the person could be honestly saying they truly don't remember, but in Locke's view, the way the legal system would work is, since the fact is proved against the person, then they would be found justly guilty. Now, what about the obvious problem of, well, what about, kind of final punishment? Suppose the person really didn't remember it at all. Well, given Locke's view, it wouldn't be them. But Locke says in a way, don't worry, once people die, then all the secrets shall be laid open, and so if the person truly didn't remember doing that stuff, it wouldn't be the person. So in the afterlife, it wouldn't be on their list of sins. Or so Locke claims. Now, he does, however, consider a defense, we'll look at it in just a moment, that is kind of like the modern, like, insanity or that wasn't that person defense. Here's the idea. Now, he does consider, of course, that people can lose their memories beyond the capacity to recover them. And the question to be is, like, is that the same person? And Locke, gets back to the, use of the word I. Now, in normal usage, we think same man or woman is the same person. But, given Locke's view, the same man with different consciousness makes different people, or so he claims. Now, to prove this, here's how he argues for that. One, what we call like the insanity defense, that we don't punish people, we don't punish mad people for what the sane person did, which the more common thing, of course, is the opposite. We don't punish someone who's like recovered from madness for the things they did when they were mad. It's the classic insanity defense. If we can show that someone, the way it works in the courts is you have to show they don't understand good or evil. But what he thinks is that if we can show someone's like insane, his interpretation of the way would be that it's not the same person. So if someone is like in a frenzy and crazy and insane, and they do something, and then they recover, Locke's view would be that there'd be two different persons. The person had no recollection. So the first support for this is what he regards as a legal proof. It's the way the legal system works. Second thing is he appeals to language. We have phrases and sayings in the language that say, we say things like, a person is beside themselves, or a person is not themselves, or a person might say, you're not the same person I knew. Now, one way to look at it is that to take it on face value, that really does mean that person is not the same person. Another way to look at it is this, it's just like an expression. Just like when someone says they're going to kill somebody, they don't always mean that. Sometimes they do, but not always. So there are two main arguments here. The legal one and the this is the way we talk argument. Now, so to recap that, his view basically is this. So from the practical standpoint of the legal system, suppose you have someone, again, committing some sort of misdeed, and they claim to the court that they don't remember doing it. On Locke's view, if we have like adequate evidence that it was the same man or woman, they'd be justly punished because there's no way to tell from a practical standpoint if they have the same consciousness or not. But Locke says when the person, dies, then God, of course, will know the truth of the matter. So they won't be punished for what they did, and it won't be what they actually remember. But then he does allow that in cases where someone doesn't have, where we actually do know that the person is not the same person or not in control, then we would not punish them. Now, in some ways, Locke here is anticipating the sleepwalking defense. When I was mentioning last time the example of the sleepwalking, I mentioned the case with a person who got apparently drove across town, killed his mother-in-law, drove back. And his defense was he was sleepwalking. In a sense, it wasn't him. Interestingly, he was actually acquitted because he was on a medication. The side effect didn't say, you may drive across town, kill your mother-in-law, but it had, the medication was known, or eventually known, to have unusual effects. You might have heard of, similar things where people do like sleep eating. They're on a medicine. Ironically, I think it's like a weight loss medicine, and they wake up and they'll be asleep in their kitchen eating or gambling or doing something. And so the claim essentially is one Locke gives. And the person is not conscious of what they're doing, it's not them. They're not guilty. Now, one sort of problematic implication for Locke's view, though, is given, the thing with God, imagine the following type of scenario. Suppose you have two terrorists, and they go to, they plant a bomb, blows up, kills a lot of people, and then when they're being, captured, one of the terrorists is killed on the spot. Pow! And so that person goes off to, he remembers everything he did. God says, oh, murdered a lot of people, shoot, hell. The other person gets shot in the head, and they don't remember anything. They have no recollection of what happened. Now, of course, by human law, they get punished for the crime, perhaps sentenced to death, but then if they don't remember, by the convenience of not remembering it, they wouldn't be punished for that. Now, Locke doesn't consider maybe like God, repairs the hard drive, so to speak, and restores everything, make sure people are accountable. So Locke doesn't really go into that particular issue there. Now, last thing here, Locke's view basically is if a person remembers doing something, then they did it. If they don't remember, they didn't do it. Interestingly and boringly enough, the people in law enforcement are working on a device that, for quite some time, that literally does read people's minds. And of course, right now, the device is really, not really real, but what they're working on is something that can test people's memory. And the theory basically is, what they're kind of working on now is they would show a person, a suspect, information about a crime that only the suspect would know. And if they get like a positive memory response, and that'd be taken as evidence the person is guilty. Now, this is obviously not in the courts now, it's all very theoretical, but kind of the ideal would be if you could scan someone's memory, you'd be able to know, what they did. And so you might see someday when memory scanning gets better, they may actually see that in courts, where they go and put the sci-fi helmet on people and scan their memory to see if they remember or not. Or maybe kind of like lie detector, maybe so unreliable that it has no admissibility. Locke closes by considering more unusual cases. We're asked to imagine you've got one body with a day consciousness and a night consciousness. And there's actually a short story that has that kind of as a theme. Like there's one person in charge during the day, another at night. Now again, for Locke, it's all about the consciousness. So the self is not determined by the identity or diversity of substance, but by the consciousness. So for Locke, the key thing is to put it all into a nutshell. For Locke, a person is his or her consciousness. Not the body, not the soul, the consciousness. So that takes us to the end of our good dead friend, John Locke, and his pretty complicated view of personal identity. Before going to our next dead person, David Hume, who we saw before, anything about John Locke that needs more Locke stuff? Okay, we saw stuff about our good dead friend David Hume before. Scottish philosopher, died in 1776, still dead today. Like Locke, an empiricist, and he's writing after Locke. And so one thing that happens in philosophy, very much like in any field, you usually have people come after someone kind of responding, changing, refining their views. So on Locke's view, we end up with material substance, immaterial substance, consciousness. The conscious is the person, but he's got all this substance stuff going on. And Hume, what he's trying to do in many ways is kind of purify empiricism, to see where empiricism takes him. Now, he claims that other philosophers, he's talking about our good dead friend John Locke, our good dead friend Descartes, claim that they can sense or experience the self. They're aware of its existence, its continuance, its identity, its simplicity. They can just somehow know it. Now, being an empiricist, what Hume does is he says you should go and look. And the way you go and look for the self is essentially introspection. And so what does he say that he finds when he looks into his mind's eye? Well, what he claims is this. What he experiences is a perception. And he's never without a perception, and it's nothing but perceptions. So what does that mean? Well, a perception, to give an example, is basically what you're experiencing now. It's just, crudely put, it's what's going on right now, what you're experiencing. I mean, to illustrate a little, I guess, a little more exactly, you kind of think of it as like media files in your mind, so to speak. So example, one perception might be, you get a perception of like a itch on your finger. You get a feeling, the feeling of the warmth of the room. That'd be a perception. Then of course you get your visual field perceptions, what you're seeing. Then you get your audio perceptions, what you're hearing. And then you've got all like the ones of sensation. So all the stuff you are seeing, all that you're seeing, hearing, feeling, etc., those are all perceptions. Crudely put, it's like this stream of consciousness, all that stuff in there. Now, he claims that whenever he's conscious, he's never without a perception. There's always something going on. And he claims that there's nothing in there but the perceptions. So never without them, and nothing but perceptions. And he considers what would happen if all the perceptions were taken away. And he thinks when they're gone, he's gone. And for example, if one is sleeping and perceiving nothing, in effect the person claims is gone. Now, and he thinks that, again we saw Hume's thing on the immortality of the soul, he thinks that if death took away all the perceptions permanently, that would be it. Now, when it comes to other philosophers, he says, well, maybe other people are different. Maybe when they poke around inside their mind, they see that, metaphysical self. And Hume says if they're different, then, well, they're different. Maybe they're totally different from me. I mean, to use a crappy analogy, there are some flavors. There's like a flavor that some people can taste, some people can't. And so if someone tastes the flavor, they do. And if someone can't, they don't. They're different. Or similar like color vision. Some people are colorblind, and some people aren't. And so Hume's essentially saying, maybe people are really different. Maybe he just sees perceptions, other people don't. Maybe they can somehow see that continuing self. This is, of course, something you can try yourself. You looking around in your mind and see what you can see. Do you find that mysterious metaphysical self, or do you just find feelings, thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc.? Now, Locke ends up claiming this. Hume. He says that a person ends up being just a bundle of perceptions. What's that mean? Well, badly drawn. Basically, here's what's going on. Imagine, if you will, that these badly drawn little circle thingies are perceptions. Each one is a perception. This would be like, feeling of hunger. This one would be like, itchy sensation on your little toe. This would be, say, your thought of, did I remember to pay my phone bill this month? This would be, say, a slight feeling of hunger. This would be like the sound that you hear right now. And so there'd be all these little perceptions kind of bundled together. I mean, it really would look like that, but imagine it's like that. So, to use like another crappy analogy, you can imagine like a bunch of marbles, just like, in a pile. Or, whatever, gumballs, or whatever you want, like in a pile. Now, they're a bundle because you notice that there's like they're not like in a bag or a bowl, there's not something that they're in. They're just a bundle. They're just kind of, you can imagine them, to use a crap analogy, kind of like magnetic balls. They're kind of stuck together, but there's nothing like wrapped around them. They're not in a bag or box or anything. So just a bundle. Now he thinks, and here's where the problem comes in, that these perceptions are in perpetual flux. That is to say, they constantly change. And we can try this, ourselves. Every moment, something's different. I mean, to use the obvious example here, different sounds, I'm saying different stuff. And when you move your head a little bit, your perception of the room changes ever so slightly. And then, new feelings and sensation occur. Your toe might start itching, you may start feeling itching sensation on your finger. Or you might be thinking, you stop thinking about, did I pay my phone bill, to thinking about, I wonder if there's going to be anything good on Netflix, next month. And so it constantly is changing. So you get the bundle of one moment, and the bundle of the next moment, and they're not identical. So, as he says, there's no power to remain the same. So his view is basically, to this point, if you ask Hume, okay Hume, what's a person? He says, like a bundle of perception, they're a bundle of perceptions. And moment to moment they change. To use a final crappy analogy, think of like if you're doing the dishes and you have all the soap in there and you get the bubbles, and they're forming and popping and forming and popping. And it's kind of like that, so imagine your consciousness is like bubbles that are popping and forming. And every moment, of course, the bubbles are different. Then he switches to his own analogy. He says the mind is a kind of theater where the numerous perceptions in turn make their appearance. But he quickly, in a way, makes the analogy and quickly dismantles it, because he says there's no simplicity there. For Descartes believed the soul is an immaterial substance, and that's the person. Whereas for Hume, he thinks it's like this complex thing, bundle of all these perceptions. He also thinks there's no identity, namely that second to second, the contents change. To use, again, another kind of crappy analogy, think about watching a movie. And imagine the movie is like the movie of someone's perceptions. And, kind of like, have you ever seen, it's like a first-person shooter, or a first-person perspective movie. And of course, it's changing constantly. It's never the same thing. Now, Hume quickly kind of repudiates his analogy the following way. He says, it's like a theater, but it's not. Because with a theater, of course, you've got a stage, you've got a place, you get lights and so forth, and you have the actors appearing on the stage. But Hume says we have no idea what the stage is there a stage at all, where do these things appear, and so in a way he kind of says, here's my analogy, but it's crap, so throw it away. Now what ultimately he kind of asks us to accept is that the self is just those perceptions, and there's nothing holding it up. And I'll use a crappy analogy to illustrate it. Imagine if, we can use the analogy of the LCD and the screen. So it's kind of like, this is like, say, perception at a given moment, and it's appearing, on the screen as opposed to the theater. Now, Hume says, of course, we have no idea what the theater is. So what we have to imagine is, imagine the perception there, but take away the screen, the wall, the projector, and still leave the perception there. So there's no substance behind it. Which seems pretty weird, but that's what he claims. So at this point, what should you know about David Hume? Well, first, he says, other philosophers go and look, and they think they find a simple continuing self. He says, I'll go look in my own head, see what I can find. What does he find? Just perceptions, no simple self. And he finds the perceptions constantly change. So he takes the view that self is just all those perceptions. It's just a bundle of perceptions like soap bubbles constantly popping and reforming and popping and reforming. And he says it's kind of like a theater, except it's a crappy analogy because it's really not like a theater. Before pressing on, anything about Hume so far that needs more Hume stuff? Now, one thing Hume does that's interesting or perhaps boring is that when we looked at like Locke and Descartes, they're trying to answer kind of the metaphysical and epistemic questions, namely like what is, or what do we know, or how do we know. Hume, interestingly and boringly enough, takes almost a analysis or a psychological approach, because he gets into the metaphysics and epistemology, but then he quickly turns to the question of not like what there is, but why do we think that way? So some people have suggested he's kind of psychoanalyzing, humanity to see why we think the way we do. So he turns from the question of kind of the metaphysics, what is the person, to a more psychological question, namely, why do we ascribe this identity? To use kind of a crappy analogy, he's going from the question, is there a monster in your closet, to the question, why do you think there's a monster in your closet? So why do we think that? Well, here's how he thinks we make it happen. Every distinct perception, he claims, is just that, totally distinct. I'll use a crappy analogy to illustrate that. Think of like back when they had like film that was like film. I guess you can still get it. And or if you ever done any video editing, you can still set many of the editing programs like Camtasia and Premiere and Final Cut and so forth. You can kind of set things up in kind of a film strip format. So imagine we get like a strip of film, and imagine that each cell is a perception. Now, for Hume, every one of these is distinct. They're non-identical, and also the film strip analogy, like his theater analogy, quickly falls apart because for Hume, they're not connected. So perhaps a better analogy would be just a bunch of photos, not connected at all. Think of like a time lapse. It's taking a picture of like kind of the same thing, so you see each one seems to be the progression of the other. Now, going with my crappy analogy, each one is distinct. The photos are not connected; they're not linked. Just like our perceptions are not connected; they're not linked. Every moment of time is separate, like a distinct soap bubble or a bead on just a bunch of beads or a bunch of M&Ms in a bowl. Now, what he thinks we do is psychologically is we suppose they're connected. We imagine, to go with my crappy analogy, we imagine the beads are on a thread, even though we don't experience the thread. And so we attribute to these an identity. So basically, there is no identity, he claims, but it's sort of a psychological thing. Again, going back to my crappy example, he's gone from, is there a monster in your closet, to why do you think there's such a thing? So he's gone from what is personal identity to why do we think there's such a thing? Why do we have this psychological, thing going on? And then he turns to more detail about how we work this out. According to Hume, there are three relations in the world. Resemblance, things being alike, like that chair resembles that chair. Contiguity, being close in space and time, like that chair is close to that chair. And lastly, causation, that one thing causes another. Now for Hume, as I mentioned before, causal connection is basically a psychological thing. It's essentially, I gave the illustration of Pavlov's dog. Person rings the bell, dog gets food, keeps going and going and going, and the dog associates the bell with the food. And so the dog would start to think, bell causes food. And Hume thinks the same thing happens to us. One thing followed by another. It happens enough times, we become habituated. So for Hume, causation is basically psychological. We expect one thing will follow another. And he thinks these are the uniting principles that tie everything together. Now, contiguity thinks is out. So what we rely on is resemblance and causation. So going back to my crappy analogy of photographs, if we see, imagine you like a picture of, like a dog jumping for a frisbee. So picture one, you see like the frisbee here, dog's on the ground, here, frisbee's here, dog's like up in the air, dog's catching the frisbee in this one, on the ground in this one, running off in that one. And of course what we do psychologically is we say, aha, these are all connected. We link them together because of the resemblance. They're not exactly the same, but they look alike, so we connect them in a series. So Hume thinks we do the same thing with our perceptions. The perception you have right now resembles what you were perceiving before, resembles what you were perceiving before, and so you believe there's a connection between them, or so he claims. Because the idea is sort of transition easily from one to another. Going back to my crap analogy, if we have those photographs that seem to show a sequence, and we're asked to sort things out of the pictures out, we put them in that order, because they seem to follow a sequence. And we would think that it's showing the same thing. Now, the way the personal identity sort of works for him is this. As you recall in the ancient days of a few minutes ago, we're talking about how for John Locke, a person is his or her consciousness, or crudely put, a person is his or her memory. Now, so what happens according to Hume is this. We think that images resemble their objects. To use a modern analogy, we think that photos resemble what they're photographs of. And so we would think that our mental stuff resembles what's out there. And what happens is when our perceptions resemble each other, just like the photographs, just like we think this is one scene, different photos of one event, we think that our different perceptions are one continuing thing, namely the self. So memory discovers and contributes to the production of this identity. So the way it works is we remember perception now, and perception before, and that's what connects it together. So if you take a concrete example, you look around the room, and once you get over here, you remember having looked over here. And so you think, yes, it was me looking across there, because I remember that. The memory connects everything together, or so people think. So that's the resemblance part. Next he turns to the causation part. He brings up another analogy, in this case an analogy to a commonwealth, a country, a nation. Now, one way to look at the mind is a system of perceptions linked by cause and effect. And he draws an analogy to a republic. We can take, for example, the United States. Is the United States the same size it was in 1789? No, it's much bigger. We had 13 colonies then. Now we get 50 states and Puerto Rico, and some territories and some other stuff, lots of bases. Do we have the same people? No. Maybe some. No, I don't think anybody's that old, but it could be. Yeah, the laws are different, the buildings are different, lots of stuff is different. But we say it's the same country because the United States 2015 is linked back by a causal chain back to 1789 or 1776, whether you want to go with Constitution or Declaration of Independence. And so we say it's the same country because of that causal connection. And Hume says the same thing applies to the self. If you trace back yourself of, now, June 4th, 2015, all the way back to your beginning. And you say this, that even though you're different, much larger than you were when you were, say, 2 months old, and very, very different, but you say there's that connection, causal connection, linking. So Hume considers, resemblance and causation. Now, much like our good dead friend Locke, he does note that what kind of drives personal identity is concern. Namely that it's our concern about, our we, past things, either good or bad, and future things, either good or bad. So in a way, for Hume, personal identity is kind of a very practical matter dealing with our concern about stuff. So, for example, if a person has like misdeeds hidden in their past, they would worry that those would come up. Or if they've done like, great things, then they're probably hoping, for some, or looking back at their glory days or hoping for some reward. Likewise, to look to the future, if you've got, a sweet job lined up after graduation, you're probably looking forward to that. If you don't have a sweet job lined up after graduation, you may be looking forward with some trepidation, maybe considering more school, grad school or something. And so Hume seems to be, right about that. That's kind of our practical concern. Now, swinging back to memory, our good dead friend Locke said, essentially memory is personal identity. Crudely put, you are your memory. You remember it, it's you don't remember, not you. So what role does Hume give to memory? Well, what he claims is this. Memory, he regards memory as sort of bringing up past perceptions. To use a crappy analogy, think of memory as like your shoebox full of photos. You pop it open, and you ruffle through them, or rifle through them. Now he thinks that what memory does, though, is contrary to Locke, it doesn't form our identity, it acquaints us with identity. How so? Well, it works like this. If we had no memory, we'd have no notion of causation, which makes sense. You couldn't remember anything, you'd never be able to, like with Hume's account, you'd never make that connection. You wouldn't see A followed by B. Every moment would be totally new. Every moment would be a surprise. It can be kind of horrifying because it's like the stove. Put your hand in the stove, it burns. You forget. You do it again, it burns. You just keep doing that until the hand is, I guess, gone. So memory allows us to get the notion of causation. And what Hume thinks is once we get the notion of causation from our memory, then we're able to do the personal identity thing. So what we do is, using our memory, we get the notion of causation, which gives us the idea that we extend back in time. At this point, he criticizes Locke's view, namely the view that you are your memory. And here's why. One thing everyone realizes pretty quickly is we forget a lot of stuff. One of the easiest ways to tell is like, taking a test. You can see all the material, and if our memories were like, perfect, we'd always get like hundreds on true, false, multiple choice tests. Well, not all of them, but if we had perfect memory, we'd do a lot better. And we forget stuff all the time. We forget phone numbers, people's names, appointments, bills, birthdays, anniversaries, etc. And so we forget all kinds of stuff. Now, given Locke's view, if you are your memory, if you forget, it wasn't you. And Hume's view is this, that we don't think that's true. We don't think that if we forget it wasn't us, we think that we forgot. And a good example of this is like when someone forgets an anniversary. If someone forgets like an important anniversary and doesn't get flowers or dinner or candy or whatever, the person doesn't say, oh yes, you forgot so it wasn't you. They generally aren't too happy. And so forgetting stuff, if Locke was right, we just say, oh, I forgot. If you did, it wouldn't be you. You wouldn't be responsible for anything you forgot, which could be kind of handy. But of course the world doesn't work that way. We don't seem to think that way. We think when people forget, it was still them, they just forgot. And so for Hume, he thinks what memory does is discovers personal identity. Once you get memory, you get a notion of causation, you get a notion of yourself, continuing across time, and then he says, we can then extend our identity beyond memory, because we can say things like, I don't remember everything that happened there, but I remember what happened when I was like 2 days old, but I had to be, because I'm here now. So there wasn't me, then. So I don't remember exactly what happened, 5 years ago today at this time. Actually, I was teaching, so I guess I kind of do probably the same thing. I don't remember exactly, of course, but I can infer back that, because of causation, that I was there. And so his criticism is that intuitively, we think that forgetting doesn't make us not us, we think we can extend our identity beyond our memory, and so memory isn't personal identity, it's how we discover. Now at this point, it seems like he's worked out, you know, kind of an okay theory. What is a person? Bundle of perceptions. Why do we think, you know, we have identity? Well, we get the notion of resemblance, they give, you know, then we get memory, from our memory get causation, and we think we can extend our identity back across time, so we think we persist across time, blah, blah, blah. But then Hume goes kind of nuts at the end. So after laying all this theory, he then goes into some kind of, I don't want to say breakdown, but things do in fact break down. So his final view is this. He says, questions about personal identity, despite the fact that he's written all this stuff, can never be decided. Why? Well, his claim is that there are sort of paradigm cases, but it ends up sort of getting into fuzzy, gray areas that are unclear. And so we end up not being able to say what personal identity is. So he ends up claiming that it is essentially grammatical rather than philosophical. What does he mean by that? Well, by the grammar, it seems to mean that it's a matter of like what words like I appropriately apply to. So it's almost like a problem of, you know, an English class problem. Because as he sees it, the identity of things depends on the relation of ideas, as you call from, you know, Hume's criticism of, you know, religion, that there's relations of ideas which are about, you know, that are things that are not about the world, but about, you know, our concepts of them. And again, he notes the problem that the claims of identity can diminish across time. What he seems to have in mind is something like this. You can imagine, you know, as people get like really old and they forget most of their childhood, and people, in fact, for example, Clarence Darrow, one of the famous lawyers from the infamous Scopes Monkey trial, he wrote an essay on basically, you know, death, and his view was that he knew he was, you know, long ago like a young boy, but he says he really can't remember anything from that, and then in effect he's not the same person. And this may be kind of what Hume has in mind, that when we're talking about trying to establish like identity, being the same person, it starts getting all fuzzy. Now if you bring in things like issues like Alzheimer's, brain injuries, old age, etc., then it does seem to start getting pretty fuzzy. And so what he ends up saying is kind of throwing up his hands saying, you know, this is a mess, so all disputes about personal identity are merely verbal, that there's really no substantial thing to debate. And then he kind of gives up. So, for Hume, quick recap for like test quiz thing. So Hume's view is basically, person is a bundle of perceptions. And the way you sort this out, the reason why I think that is because of resemblance. Resemblance gives us memory. Memory gives us causation. And then we think we can extend our identity back, you know, through the breaks in our memory. And then he, you know, is critical of those who accept memory of personal identity, saying intuitively we think we can do that, so they're wrong. But then he kind of, it all goes to pieces. So his ultimate sort of view is, it's a question of grammar. It's all verbal. There's no way to settle this. So essentially he just wasted all that time. Okay, before moving away from Hume, anything about Hume or bundles or time wasting that needs more stuff? Okay, now we turn to our good dead friend, the Buddha, talking about Buddha's no self doctrine. So far we've gone from, you know, Locke's view, the view that the person, you know, you got the body, you got the soul, you got the consciousness, to Hume's view, which is that bundle view. Of course, he ultimately ends up saying, you know, it's all grammar, you know, this can't be decided. But now we go to sort of beyond Hume to an even more kind of extreme view, put forth by our good dead friend, the Buddha. Now in this little dialogue, there are two characters. Actually, if Nagasena, you know, speaking the Buddha's doctrine is correct, there are no characters. There is no one at all. But for the sake of, you know, labeling things, we have Nagasena and we have the king. and the king is speaking to Nagasena, and Nagasena says to the king, basically the king asks him who he is, and he says that his name is Nagasena, but this is a mere word, or mere noise, a mere appellation, because there is no self. And one key doctrine of Buddhism, at least one of the forms, there are actually many forms, is the doctrine of no self. If you ever saw the classic movie, The Matrix, there's a part where Keanu Reeves, well, Neo, is talking to the young boy, and then he's trying to bend the spoon. And what the boy says to him is, the secret is there is no spoon. And of course, it's a reference to the Buddhist view that there is no self. Now the king, being a pretty sharp guy, asks Nagasena some obvious questions. Namely, if there is no self, as Nagasena claims, then who is it that provides the priests with robes and food and shelter and other items? Who is it that uses all these things? Who is it that keeps the precepts? Who meditates? Who commits immorality? Who tells lies? Now the answer is, of course, this. If there is no self, then there is no merit or demerit, because there is no one to do wicked things, there is no one to do great things. Because there's no one who, since there's no one who does any deeds, there is no results of these deeds, because there's no one to do them. There is no murder, because there is no one to kill, there is no one to be killed. There are no teachers, there are no students, there is no self. And so the implications are pretty clear. If there's no self, there's none of that stuff. Now the king, of course, is not satisfied by this, so he presses Nagasena further. And what he does is kind of similar to what Locke does. It's basically a consideration by elimination. So, to use kind of a crappy analogy, suppose, well, when I was a kid, I was always curious about machines. And what I always had to do was I always wondered, what's really important to a machine, how does it work? And of course, the way to find out is take stuff apart. And that's how I found out about electricity, the hard way. But it's a pretty good approach, because if you take stuff apart and it still keeps working, you know what's important and what's not important. Because the piece you take out and it stops, well, that was important. That should probably go back in there. And in a sense, this is what Nagasena and the king are doing. They're trying to basically take away from the supposed Nagasena to see what if they take it away, it's no longer Nagasena, to find who he is. And Locke kind of did that. Locke said you could take away the body, you could take away the soul, and you can still have the same person. But if you take away the consciousness, you don't have the person anymore. So what he does is run through step by step. I mean, some stuff is pretty obvious. For example, he's obviously not the hair, which would be good, because every time you get a haircut, you'd be a different person. It's not the nails, etc. Now his point here is not, he's not claiming, okay, a person could be their hair, or their nails, or their toe. What he basically is eliminating here is all the physical stuff. So much like Locke did, he's saying Nagasena is not the body. So that's out. Then he turns to sensation, feeling, thought, etc. So essentially considering, the consciousness. Is Nagasena that? And Nagasena says, no, he's not any of that. Is Nagasena anything else? Form, etc., etc. No. So basically we end up with, kind of, badly drawn. I think it's worse every time. So, basically it takes away, you've got the body, and he says, well, are you the body? Nagasena says, no, take that away. Is he the consciousness, etc., etc.? Nope, take that away. Is anything else? Nope, take that away. And once you take away everything, you're left with a whole bunch of nothing. And so the conclusion is, is, as the king goes through all the questions, and none of these are Nagasena, the only possible conclusion is that there is no Nagasena. It is merely an empty sound. There is no self. So we transition from Locke, your art of consciousness, to Hume, which is your bundle, also doesn't know what the heck's going on, to the Buddhist view in which there is no self at all. Now, interestingly, boringly enough, in addition to the no-self doctrine, sort of classical Buddhism has the notion of reincarnation, of rebirth. Because super simplified Buddhism, basically here's how reality works. We're all trapped on the wheel of rebirth, which on one hand, initially sounds kind of cool. Wow, I exist forever. But here's why it's not cool. According to Buddhism, that wheel of rebirth leads one to life, and one of the most important noble truths of Buddhism is life is pain. So there's suffering. And so what happens is you live, you suffer, you die, you're reborn, you suffer, you die, you're reborn. So it's like being tortured for forever, which is not so cool. Now, for the Buddhists, as we saw, the idea is there actually is no self. So who is suffering? No one. So you end up with kind of a weird metaphysical puzzle. If there is no self, how am I suffering? Now the Buddhist solution to this is to realize that there is no self. To cease all desires, including the desire to be free of the wheel of life. And what they claim will happen is one will achieve nirvana, a state of no wind, where it's like the perfect realization of no self. And once that realization occurs, according to Buddhism, once you truly, well, there is no you, once it is truly realized there is no self, then you cease to be. You're not, you never were, but there's no rebirth. And so the whole point of original Buddhism is to have that realization and realize that you are not. Which is, again, seems kind of weird and paradoxical, because if you're not, then how are you suffering, and how does this Buddhism stuff free one of that? But that's kind of the deal. And getting back to kind of the original question is, if there is no self, how is there any rebirth? Because if there is no self, there can't be any transmigration. Now, if you believe in a soul, then reincarnation is easy to handle. Soul, body dies, soul goes out, gets a new body. To use a crappy analogy, it's kind of like a car. You get your car, drive along, car wears out, you get a new car, drive that car, wears out, get a new car, keep going. Now, to illustrate this, Nagasena uses two examples to show that how rebirth takes place without transmigration. Example one, light. He claims if you imagine you get a lit candle, an unlit candle, and you touch them together, the claim is that the light is lit from another light, nothing transmigrates, so that's how rebirth occurs. Second example is poetry. When you learn poetry from a teacher, like a verse, poem like "Think I'll never see anything as beautiful as a tree," or "Roses are red," blah blah blah. What happens is there's no transmigration, but somehow the verse, occurs. And so using those two illustrations, according to Nagasena, that's how it takes place. So we end up with Buddhism, there being no self. Before pressing on, anything about no self that needs more stuff? We now turn to ghosts and minds. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, there's very little philosophical examination of ghosts, even though they're really popular in popular culture. You have Ghostbusters, Ghost Hunters, and of course ghost stories are probably as old as humanity. Tales of the dead, their spirits going about. Now there is reference in the Phaedo, one of Plato's dialogue, that does talk about spirits haunting an area. But in terms of philosophically examining them, pretty much nothing, up until this. And so the purpose of this essay is to examine ghosts in the context of philosophy of mind, basically for a couple purposes. One is to sort of illustrate, some of the main theories or concepts in philosophy of mind, which is the philosophy of what is a mind, and also, of course, to consider the matter of, ghosts. And, ghost stories are cool, so it's kind of cool. But that's philosophy, so I guess it's not cool. So I guess it kind of washes out. Now, of course, being philosophy and all, we gotta have a definition of what a ghost is. Because in order to discuss about whether they're possible or not, we gotta know what we're talking about. So basically there are two, kind of sticking with the intuitive view of ghost, there's kind of two conditions for being a ghost. Well, actually three. First, the ghost is going to be a mind, which is say it's got to be a proper ghost, it's got to be like a person. Otherwise, it's just zombies, for example, are ghosts. So it's got to be a mind. Secondly, of course, to be traditional sort of ghost, it's got to be the original body's got to be dead. So it's got to be disembodied. So second thing is that, well, actually it's kind of two things. Body's dead, original body's dead, but it doesn't have a body. Because something dead moving around would be like a zombie if it doesn't think, or if it's thinking, then it'd be like a vampire or possibly a ghoul. So you got to get rid of that body, because we're not talking about zombies or vampires, we're talking about ghosts. But of course, to be a proper ghost, because at this point, if we just have a spirit, a soul that was in a body, that the body's dead, this would mean that heaven would be like haunted. But we don't think of heaven as like a haunted place. So ghosts are not like spirits in heaven, they're still interacting here in the physical world. So basically we have three things going. It's got to have a mind, has to have lost the original body and be disembodied, and it's got to be able to interact somehow with the physical world. In fact, the classic example, of course, in German, Poltergeist, which means literally noisy ghost. It can, move stuff around, lower temperatures, etc. That is also the subject of the classic movie Poltergeist, which is being remade almost identically with the movie by the same name. But I don't know if it's going to be good or not. Original, pretty good. I'm not sure if the remake is going to be good, because usually remakes are bad, but not always. But anyways, the original's a good movie. So if you ever got nothing to watch on Netflix, Poltergeist is there. Could be worth seeing. Now, the interaction requirement can be pretty minor. Like I said, there's some, in classic sort of Goth mythology, there are ghosts like Poltergeists who can, suppose they can move furniture and move stuff around, but their interaction may be pretty minor. Like, for example, it may only be able to, slightly move stuff, or maybe lower. Another classic thing is like lowering temperatures, but it has to be able to at least do something. So those are kind of the conditions, base conditions for ghostiness. Mind, lost original body, doesn't have a body now, and is capable of somehow interacting with the physical world. Now, in sort of, many classic ghost stories and on movies like Ghostbusters, ghosts, of course, are usually cast as being incorporeal, that is to say, immaterial spiritual entities. And everyone's, probably seen movies with ghosts where they move through walls, and you can still see them, but somehow they move through walls, etc. But, to avoid begging any questions, it won't be assumed that ghosts have to be immaterial substances. That it's allowed that ghosts could be potentially physical. And of course, if you want to go with like the, some myths or movies, think of like, ectoplasm. If you ever saw Ghostbusters, that slimy stuff. So ghosts can kind of like move through walls, but they usually leave like some stuff, that ectoplasm. We now turn to the theories of mind and what they have to say about ghosty stuff. Now, one classic theory is what's called identity theory, and literally it's what its name means. Identity theory takes the view that the mind is the brain, or the nervous system. It's a materialist theory, so people who are identity theorists, they believe there's just matter. There's no immaterial stuff. So a person would be, I guess we can throw on the spinal cord as well. So a person, the mind would be brain, nervous system. The reason why they call it identity theory is because every mental state is identical to a particular state of the central nervous system. To use a crappy inaccurate illustration, think of like, it'd be kind of like this. Pain of stepping on nail and big toe would be neuron, 175, 174, 173, firing in a triangle pattern. I'm just making this crap up, basically. But the idea would be, that would be that particular pain. Thinking of a celebrity, let's say Jennifer Aniston, would be like this pattern. That would be the Jennifer Aniston, neural pattern. Being hungry for pizza would be like the pizza pattern, whatever that would be. So the idea is that every mental state is identical to a particular brain state. So the mind is that. The mind is your brain, and notice the brain, this particular firings. Now the reason why that's popular is because it did seem to make sense. You've got a brain that does stuff. So why not just say the mind is the brain? Now in this view, if that view is correct, if you are your brain, then there are no ghosts. Why? Well, when your brain goes, you go. No brain, no you, no mind, so no ghosts. So if identity theory is correct, if you are your brain, then that's it. No ghosts. Also no afterlife. Now, a second view, which is pretty old, is what's called substance dualism. We've seen this before. Descartes got this view, Locke's got this view, and so on this view, you would have, what would be is, what you're seeing right now would be a body with a immaterial substance, driving it or powering it, however you want to look at it. Locke would also fall in this view, because he does have, even though consciousness is not a substance, he does seem to accept dualism. You get a physical body, you get a soul, and presumably the consciousness kind of hangs out in the soul, however that works. So you get two types of entities, material, immaterial. Now, dualism gives us the best possibility of survival after death. Why? Well, if we've got a body and a soul, a spirit, then we could, at least, in theory, lose the body, and perhaps the soul could survive. And so we could, since there's two parts, and we are our soul, when the body dies, we could keep going. Maybe not, but at least it's possible. So ghost would be a possibility. So it meets kind of the first condition. For the substance dualist, you could lose your original body and continue to exist after death. But what about the other thing, namely being able to interact with the physical world? Well, here's kind of how that might work. In philosophy, there's what's called the mind-body problem, which arises for dualists, which is, the problem is this: how does the ghost control the machine? And I always kind of, picture like a kind of stupid cartoon of like a ghost trying to work the levers, and of course the hands, ghosty hands just go through it. It's a problem of, this problem is that how does the ghost control that? How does the immaterial work with the material? Now, if the soul can control the body and make it do stuff, then at least in theory, even though we have no idea how this works out, if it can do that with the original body, then at least in theory, it could interact with the physical world. So you could have a disembodied, mind, somehow using whatever means it uses to control the original body, able to move stuff and do stuff. I have no idea how that would work, but at least the theory is kind of there. So dualism, substance dualism, gives us our best ghost possibility. And in many ways, it's kind of the classic ghost. The soul departed from the body, able to interact with the world. Now, there's also two other forms of dualism. One, property dualism that involves interactionism, and property dualism that involves none. But here's the idea. With substance dualism, you get two different types of stuff. You get like, physical, material stuff, and the immaterial stuff. Now, some people don't like substance. Why? Again, because it's kind of weird. Going back to the example of folder, if I take away the color, the volume, mass, density, shape, and take away all the properties, and one asks what is left, it would seem the obvious answer is nothing. There's nothing left. So some critics of substance say it's nothing, because if it has no qualities, that means it's nothing. And so some folks accept what's called property dualism. The idea is not that there are two distinct substances, because the idea is there are no such things, but the view is that the mind has mental properties. It'd be like, things like belief, thought, feeling, etc. Then there are physical properties, like mass, density, volume, location, etc. And so the mind and body are different, because they have different properties, but they're not different stuff. Now, one version of this gets a fancy name of epiphenomenalism. Now, this view works like this. Kind of badly drawn. Here's the brain, made up of physical properties. And their view is this. Now, the big problem with dualism, substance dualism, is how do the weird, physical, and mental things interact? How does a ghost, work the machine? Epiphenomenalism takes the view, well, we can solve that problem. We don't have two-way interaction. We have the physical properties causing the mental properties. It's a one-way causal street. The mental properties are epiphenomena. As I say, they're just, to use a crappy analogy, think of like a sparkler. Like the sparkler, it sparks. The sparks are like the epiphenomena. The sparkler material is causing the sparks to occur, but the sparks don't cause the material to do stuff. So, again, going with kind of a crappy illustration, it's like the physical properties make the stuff happen. And you can think of it, kind of badly drawn as like little sparks and light show going on over the brain. But it's a one-way street, just like the sparkler causes the sparks don't cause, the sparkler. So the mental properties are basically inert. Again, it's one-way street. So when you're thinking and feeling and so forth, it's just an epiphenomena, it just sparks from the physical properties. Now the main reason why people, accepted this, they said, well, it's less mysterious. With substance dualism, you've got a two-way street. The body can, the mind controlling the body sending signals to the mind, and so you get a two-way interaction. With epiphenomenalism, it's half as bad. It's just one-way connection. But people pointed out critics pointed out, well, that's pretty weird too. It's not like half as weird, it's still totally weird. If you use a crap analogy, it'd be like someone who said, I ran to the moon and back. And you're like, well, that's crazy. And if someone said, well, I just ran to the moon. And you're like, well, that's still pretty crazy. Because it's like less weird, but still pretty weird. Now, in terms of how this works in terms of the ghosty stuff, here's the idea. If the mental properties are just like sparks, epiphenomena, well, what happens to the sparks when the sparkler burns out? Well, they're gone. And so if epiphenomenalism is correct, when the brain goes, the sparks go out. the light shows up. So if phenomenalism is correct, there are no ghosts. Now, fortunately, there is a second type of property dualism. And this one is called by the innovative name of interactionism. And as the name implies, the mental properties of the mind interact with the physical properties. So mental properties can change physical ones, physical properties can change the mental ones, vice versa. So here's the physical, brain with its physical properties. And then you get the mental properties, like feelings, thoughts, and so forth. And even though they're separate properties, so like your belief or say wanting to get a pizza is not a physical quality of your brain, but it can influence it. So you have, the want to get a pizza, and then you send, interact with your brain, and then you might go and physically seek that pizza. Or another example would be like you put your hand on something hot, you get a physical signal, ow, and then your brain, your mental properties, send a signal back, you pull your hand up. Now, since the mental and physical properties is a two-way street interacting, it leaves open the possibility that if the mental properties are like distinct and not causally dependent on the physical properties, then the physical properties could be lost. You could lose all the physical qualities, mass, density, volume, etc. But if the mental properties are left, thought, belief, feeling, etc., they might exist, like as Hume said, like in a bundle. So all the physical qualities are gone, but the mental properties remain. Now they might require something to kind of hang out in. They might require like some physical properties to like stick to. Now, interestingly enough, if you're familiar with like kind of standard, ghost literature and ghost mythology, ghosts, because people often wonder like, why don't ghosts like travel around and go on vacation? And one of the traditional things is that ghosts tend to haunt a particular area, like a battlefield, or a ship, or a particular room. And so one way to sort of explain those tales might be that the mental properties, even though they can survive the death of the body, they might like need to stick to something. So they become, connected to a particular house, or room, or battlefield, or castle. Or not. Now, given that the mental properties were already interacting with the physical world before, in the normal thing, then it does leave open the possibility that the mental properties could keep working the physical properties. So, property dualism of interactionism does allow for ghosts. Now, our final one, which one, is what's called functionalism. Functionalism works like this. It's typically a materialist view of the mind. So if you ask a functionalist, is there immaterial stuff? They typically would say no, although they don't have to. Now, the reason why it's called functionalism is because the idea is that the mental states are defined in terms of function. What does that mean? Well, here's the idea. Badly drawn. Now, for the identity theorist, their view is that, say, your wanting to have a pizza would be that exact pattern of neurons. And that's it. That is the wanting to have pizza. And if somehow you lost those neurons, you could never want pizza ever again, because you wouldn't be able to have the pizza wanting experience. Now, the functionalists take the view that mental states are not identical to particular physical states, particular neural firings. What it is, it's a matter of their function. And function is a matter of inputs and outputs. To use a crappy analogy, one way to illustrate the whole functionalism thing is to go back to the ancient days of computing. back in the days, I think it was like the 70s. Now, originally, IBM made like one of the first, PCs. And then, of course, companies wanted to copy IBM's PC and sell them. But of course, if you exactly duplicate, the patented, machine, then that of course is, that's a violation, illegal, blah, 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 violating those patents. So what they did, what computer companies did is, they wanted to be able to run, DOS, the precursor to Microsoft Windows, they wanted to be able to run the software, but they couldn't copy the hardware directly. So what they needed to do was this. Now with identity theory, you would basically be exactly duplicating an identical machine. So if you wanted to have something happen, run like a spreadsheet, you would have had to have the exact same machinery as an IBM. But of course, again, the problem was companies wanted to basically sell computers, but not pay IBM, licensing, or just wanted to do it on their own. So what they figured out was this. You didn't have to have identical hardware. All you have to do is have identical functions. So if you have like an IBM chip that does certain things, like you put in a certain input and you get a certain output, like to use a stupid illustration, you put in 2 + 2, it gives you 4 through the workings of that circuit. You don't have to duplicate the circuit, you just have to duplicate that when you get this input, you get the same output. So to use a stupid illustration, imagine the IBM does it with like a square, but if you can do the same thing with like a circle, so to speak, it's different, but it gives the same output. It's functionally identical, although mechanically different. So what the functionalist view is, it's like that clone machine. It's not identical in terms of hardware, but it's identical in terms of function. It can run, you can run DOS, it can run all the software, it does the same stuff, even though its physical makeup is quite different. To use another crappy analogy, think of like Android phones. If you have an Android phone, you might have owned a previous one. They have different chips, different designs, but they all can run Android, even though they're not identical, physically identical. What they're able to do is have the same function. Any Android phone can run Android, even though they're not physically identical. So for the functionalist, the mental states are not having the identical hardware, it's having the same functions. So whatever has the same function is the same mind. So how does this allow for a weird kind of ghost? Well, here's the idea. And this is what scientists and researchers today are kind of working on. If your mind is simply a set of functions, so whatever gets the same input gets the same output. So to use a stupid example, someone says to you, hey, you want to get some pizza? And you say, yes, I like pizza. Now if they can make something that would have the same inputs and outputs as you, according to the functionalist, that would be you. Now, since for the functionalist what matters are the functional states, that means that you could lose your original organic brain, but if all your functions of your mind were preserved in a new physical system, you would still be there. So essentially, whenever you hear like a sci-fi thing about copying a person onto a computer, they're obviously not duplicating the person's brain. You're not just taking the brain and having like a brain copy. They're duplicating the functional states. So that whatever the original you would say or do, the functional you would have the same exact thing. And for the functionalist, if it duplicated your functions perfectly, it would be you. So in a way, you could end up with a new type of ghost. Namely that it's not an immaterial ectoplasm ghost. It could quite literally be a ghost in the shell, or a ghost in the machine, where it's all your functional states and memories preserved, and it acts identical to you, so it is you. So you end up with a weird technological ghost. So in conclusion, to close in our remaining minute, dualism, property dualism, and functionalism allow for a ghost. We get like ghost classic, spooky incorporeal thing. We get kind of a possible ghost, mental properties, existing past death, and then we get the sci-fi, ghost in the shell type of deal, copying of all the functional states into a machine, preserving it. With identity theory, no ghosts. With epiphenomenalism, no ghosts. And so ends this week's class. So next week, more stuff, and then more stuff, and then
Yeah.